nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasutsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvat Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Mudakelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdna Nipatyakshito. Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pridayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Namah Jayatam Sirato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamor Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunath Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadanas Trinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhyudisam Janma Janmani Raganugami Bhajanola Samanasanam Shiradhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Padakamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatupada Padme Yaram Nikilaga Sanga Shamani Shutratritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hiraye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Sajiyad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojan Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna, Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desire, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we will continue discussion of Padyavali. So, in our last reading, we finished our exposition of the fourth quality mentioned in this 32nd verse of the text, namely the quality of Tṛṇādapi sunīceta. So, having discussed the four qualities mentioned in this verse, and earlier, prior to that, having discussed the term kirtan and the object of the kirtan hariḥ, today we'll come to the conclusion of our commentary on this verse and focus on the meaning of the word sadā, or continuously. Kīrtanīyaḥ sadā hariḥ. Why is hariḥ to be praised, or why is kirtan to be performed of Krishna continuously? So we'll look at the significance of this term, as well as give some conclusion about the import of this verse. So I've shared the file, so I'm starting from this new section. Hari is to be praised continuously. Kīrtanīyaḥ sadā hariḥ. Now that the four qualities stated in the verse under discussion, with which kirtan and all other forms of bhakti are to be performed, have been discussed, the import of the injunction given in the verse to perform kirtan of Hari continuously, sadā, will be explained. In his instructions on sadhana bhakti to Sri Sanatana, Sriman Mahaprabhu cites the following injunction that similarly enjoins a constancy of engagement in bhakti. Quote, Vishnu is to be remembered continuously and never to be forgotten. All injunctions and prohibitions should be servants of these two principal directives. So this is a statement of Padma Puran, which is also cited by Rupa Gosvami at the beginning of his exposition of Vaidhi Bhakti. So Vaidhi Bhakti being bhakti that is motivated by observance or the governance of injunctions in the Shastra. So of all injunctions in the Shastra, this one here is said to be the parent injunction or the principal injunction, and all other injunctions are for the purpose of fulfilling that. So, what's significant in reference to our subject matter, particularly, is that there's also this word satatam, which is a synonym for sadā, or constancy, or continuousness. So here it's saying Vishnu is to be remembered always, or continuously. And in our verse of discussion, we have Hari is to be praised, or to be, remembered and, honored continuously. So the way that this idea of continuousness is explained in that verse carries over to understanding what it implies in our verse of discussion. So Chakravarti Pad has commented on this. Sri Chakravarti Pad explains the overarching importance of this injunction in his commentary. Because of all injunctions given throughout the Shastra being servants of remembrance of Sri Vishnu, the accomplishment of performance of all instructed injunctions, that is, adherence to all the other injunctions throughout the Shastra, occurs only when remembrance of Sri Vishnu is being performed. Similarly, because of the innumerable prohibitions against killing cows, brahmanas, and so forth throughout the Shastras, being servants of the prohibition against forgetfulness of Vishnu, a forgetful person has the potential of becoming implicated in the innumerable sins established by all the prohibitions throughout the Shastras, whenever forgetfulness of Vishnu occurs. So the idea here is that when one is in remembrance of Vishnu, one will not perform an action which is knowingly contrary to the desire of Vishnu, or which one knows to be displeasing to Vishnu or against the wish of Vishnu. So when one is not remembering Vishnu, then that imperative sense of not performing sinful activities, or not performing activities which are against his wish, such as killing cows or brahmanas or anyone who doesn't deserve to be, or any other variety of activities that are harmful to others, then there's the potential to commit any such act, because the fundamental basis of why one would refrain from committing those acts is not in one's mind. This is what he wants to say. And rather, even if one is observing, or happens to be observing various injunctions in the Shastra, if one is not doing so with remembrance of Vishnu, then the primary purpose of those injunctions isn't being fulfilled. And thus, they're not actually being fulfilled as they're meant to be performed. So thus he says that the accomplishment of all injunctions occurs only when remembrance of Vishnu is performed. In other words, all these injunctions are meant to support awareness of Vishnu. And no doubt as well to sustain social cohesion and peace and order in the world. Not that those things don't exist, but that ultimately when one is in remembrance of Vishnu, one will not perform in a way that disturbs the order or the peace in the world anyway. I think there's a statement of, was it Machiavelli? I forget. One political philosopher who said, maybe it was Caesar, I don't recall accurately, but there's some quote to the effect that the more corrupt the citizens are, the more laws you need. In other words, when people are of educated and good nature, you don't need that many laws because they themselves will understand how to treat each other with respect and fairness. It doesn't, not that every detail of it has to be, spelled out to the T. But when people don't have that goodness and don't have that sensibility, then you have to force it upon them with more and more law. So something like that, when remembrance of Vishnu is present, when the spirit of what it means to be aware of Vishnu is there, there'll be no, lack of order and peace in the world, and there'll be no, violence or harm against others. So that, in that sense, remembrance of Vishnu is the principal thing that all the other injunctions are meant to be supporting, because once you get that remembrance, then you'll automatically behave in a way that all these injunctions would enjoin you to behave anyway, without even need to be instructed to do so. Okay, anyhow, this is the context of the injunction that we're drawing or citing as a parallel to our verse of discussion. So now we'll get to the specific point of overlap. After giving this explanation of the great importance of remembering Sri Bhagavan, Sri Chakravartipad explains the intended meaning of the word continuously, satatam, in the verse. And the reasoning given in this explanation is likewise applicable to the meaning of the mention of, quote, continuously, or sadā, in the verse under discussion. Quote, continuously, satatam, means every day, and not rather at every moment, because of the occurrence, in the case of the interpretation of satatam as at every moment, of the injunction's non-authoritativeness with respect to the characteristic of performance, on account of its impracticability. So this is something we discussed recently the other day. There's also a statement of Chakravartipad in the 9th canto to this effect, that this is a hermeneutic which comes in general from Mimamsa darshan, that the Shastra is composed by those who are faultless. So it's composed in a way that will be actually practicable for those whom a particular injunction is enjoined. In other words, an incompetent teacher or an incompetent guide will tell someone to do something that isn't appropriate for them to do or that they're unable to do. But a competent guide will know the capacity and the eligibility of an object of instruction and instruct them accordingly. So it's, as a premise, it's a principle of interpretation that the Shastras are composed properly. In other words, whatever they enjoin, for whatever the specific audience or the specific eligible group for a particular injunction then that injunction is practicable for that eligible group. So, with that assumption or that premise in place, if we read an injunction in the Shastra that seems to be impracticable or not actually practically possible to follow, then we infer that our understanding of the injunction is inaccurate, because the injunction would never enjoin something that's actually impossible. So if an injunction is appearing to enjoin something that's impossible or not actually practically achievable, then that injunction is to be considered non-authoritative, as it's understood in that way. So either the statement is not truly a statement of the Shastra, or the understanding of the statement of the Shastra is inaccurate. So in any case, whenever there's an encountered situation in which there appears to be an impracticable injunction, then either there's an issue with the source of the statement, or there's an issue with one's understanding of the statement. So when it's understood that the source of the statement is genuine, in other words, that it is a statement from a Shastra, then one has to refine one's understanding or one's interpretation of the statement such that one arrives at the intended sense, which will always be something that is practicable. So this is the concern, if you will, that Chakravartipad is raising, because the word satatam could be loosely thought of as always or continuously. So what does continuously mean? Does it literally mean, 60 seconds a minute, 60 minutes an hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year? Is that literally what it means? Or is it continuously in the sense of, I went to college continuously for 4 years? Means repetitively or repeatedly you would go to college each day, not that you spent every single second of those 4 years in college. So the same word can and is found to be used with multiple different imports. So which import is the specifically intended import, or what is quote unquote the tatparya in this case? Does quote always or continuously mean every single moment, or does it mean repeatedly on a consistent basis, such as every day? So he is giving the explanation that we have to interpret it to mean every day and not every moment, because it would be impossible to do it at every moment. Now, for those who have fervor for Harinama Kirtan, this is not meant to dampen their spirits. In other words, if they want to try to chant at every moment they can, Haribo, go for it. We're not here to dampen their spirit and say, a few minutes a day is enough. That's not the spirit of the statement. But to be precise, if we were to interpret it to mean at every single moment, that would mean that someone could never again, for the duration of their entire life, enter deep sleep. Which is not possible for a human being to sustain for very long. So if this injunction were, implied to taken literally to be at every single moment, then it would be impossible for anyone to ever enter into deep sleep, which is not humanly possible. So therefore, although the spirit of the injunction is indeed to do it as much as possible, or nearly all the time, literally speaking, we can't interpret it to actually mean at every moment, but daily and for a good measure of the day, or for a great measure of one's time, will be the intended meaning. So I've explained this a little bit. It might be repetitive, but I'll read. Sri Chakravarti Pad's explanation here is based on a principle, which he also refers to elsewhere, that an injunction is non-authoritative if it enjoins performance of something that is impossible to actually perform. So his rationale is that if the word satatam were interpreted to mean at every moment, then the injunction stated in the verse would enjoin that Vishnu be remembered at every moment. Since it is impossible for anyone to literally remember Vishnu at every single moment, the injunction would become an instance of enjoining something that is impossible to actually perform. Since Shastric injunctions are regarded as authoritative because they never enjoin or intend to enjoin anything which is not actually necessary and possible to perform, an injunction which enjoins something that is impossible to do is never accepted as an authoritative injunction. Thus, if a particular interpretation of the words in an injunction in the Shastra leads to the conclusion that something is being enjoined that is impossible, then it must be concluded that such an interpretation is not the one intended, and another interpretation must be fostered. In the injunction in the aforecited verse from Padma Puran, the meaning of continuously should thus be understood to mean every day, and not rather at every moment, since it is possible for a sadhaka to remember Sri Vishnu every day, but not possible for a sadhaka to remember him literally at every single moment. Although the drift of the injunction is undoubtedly that one should remember Vishnu as much as possible throughout the day, and not simply once in a day. Applying this rationale to the verse under discussion, the injunction, quote, Hari is to be praised continuously, kīrtanīyaḥ sadā hariḥ, should be understood to mean daily, and moreover, to mean as much as possible throughout every day, but ought not be interpreted literally to mean at every moment because of the literal impossibility of any sadhaka actually doing that. So, this will be the meaning of the word sadā, but now we'll discuss, in other words, we've explained the what, now we're going to discuss the why. But why is it enjoined to be done every day and to be done as much as possible? Why is such an injunction given? So this we get explanation of in the Vedanta Sutras and also from discussion of Jiva Gosvami. So reasons why repeated practice of kirtan, remembrance, and so forth of Sri Bhagavan and his names are in this way enjoined are discussed in the Vedanta Sutras. So the fourth pada, or the fourth section of the four sections of the Vedanta Sutra, begins with this subject. So the third section is the section on sadhana. The fourth section is the section on the fall, or the result, or the goal of the sadhana. But that fourth section begins with further discussion of the topic of sadhana, namely why the sadhana is said to be practiced repeatedly, or needs to be practiced repeatedly in order to lead one to the fall, or the attainment. So we find in the Vedanta Sutras the two sutras which are as follows. Quote, repetition of sadhana practices should be done again and again, because of instructions to do so in the Shastra, and because of indicators of the necessity for doing so. So, abritir asakrit upadeshat. So repetition is to be done because the Shastra instructs that, and lingacha, because there are indications to that effect. So what does this refer to? Let's look at the Govinda Bhashya of Baladeva Vibhushan. He comments on these as follows. Repetition of hearing about Sri Bhagavan and so forth is necessary. In this regard, because of the possibility of the attainment of a visible result in the form of realization of the Atma, that is, Sri Bhagavan, occurring as a result of these practices, hearing and so forth should be repeated until the result, that is, realization of Sri Bhagavan, is attained. Just like, for example, threshing is repeated until the visible result of unhusking grain from chaff occurs. This injunction for repetition, furthermore, should be understood to be because of the presence of offense, or aparad, on the part of a sadhaka. So, sadhana is not for its own sake, it's for the sake of the sadhya. In other words, you take up a means, or you take up a path to get to a goal. So, if you're following the path to get to the goal, and you haven't gotten to the goal yet, then keep walking on the path. In other words, if you're doing a process which needs to produce a result, and the result hasn't happened yet, then keep doing the process until the result occurs. You might think, well, why do you even need to say that? But in this case, it's important to point that out. In other words, you've taken up this sadhana to get to the fall, to get to the result. So if you've done the process, but the result hasn't come, that means more of the process needs to be done. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is said to be because of the presence of aparad. So this will be further explained as follows. The rationale explained here is that just as someone seeking to acquire grain will repeatedly thresh paddy until all the grain is separated from the chaff, so a seeker of realization of Sri Bhagavan will repeatedly engage in bhakti sadhana until they achieve prem bhakti and thereby realization of Sri Bhagavan. As was discussed in the commentary on the previous verse of Srimad Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam, with reference to statements of Sri Jiva, an act of bhakti can produce the result of prem by being performed just once, provided no offense, aparad, is present on the part of the performer. Thus, when repetition of acts of bhakti takes place without producing the result of prema, then the presence of offense, aparad, on the part of the performer is to be inferred. So one act of bhakti can immediately produce prema. If one has done one act of bhakti but still doesn't have prema, then there's something inhibiting the appearance of prema within the heart. What is the inhibitor? Aparad. So if one has performed the act and not received the result, one infers that the presence of the inhibitor is present within oneself. Sri Jiva explains this point with reference to the aforementioned Vedanta Sutras in Bhakti Sandarbha 153. Quote, injunctions in Shastra for repetition of bhakti sadhana practices, such as, in the sutra we just quoted, abriti rasukrit upadeshat, repetition of sadhana practices should be done again and again because of instructions to do so in the Shastra, carry the import that people in general are implicated in offense, aparad. In other words, it's observed in society that many people engage in these practices, and yet it's very rare to find someone who has achieved siddhi or achieved prem bhakti. So, people in general are implicated in aparad. This is the conclusion or the inference that can be drawn from this dynamic. If you do this activity once, you get prem bhakti unless you're an aparadi. Many people are doing this activity many more times than once and not getting prema bhakti. Therefore, many people are aparadis. This is the logic. Here, that is, in regard to the purification of aparad effected by repeated bhakti sadhana, the intention is that there occurs destruction of one's present inclinations, vasanas, for sin, papa, which are entirely based on previously committed offenses, aparadas, along with the offenses or aparadas themselves. So, repeatedly performing the bhakti sadhana, if one is implicated in aparad, works or continues to benefit someone, even though the direct result of performing bhakti, namely the experience of prem or the attainment of prem, has yet to occur. Nevertheless, that bhakti sadhana, performing it appropriately, is working insofar as it's purging the psyche of the effects of one's past offenses. That is, it's purging the psyche of vasanas that are contrary to bhakti, and particularly vasanas for sinful activities, or vasanas for committing aparad, and rather, it is nourishing the bhakti vasana. So, if we view the whole culture of bhakti from a psychological perspective, this is the whole game, is that, the mind is to be conditioned such that it is fit to receive a self-manifestation of Bhagavan's Sarup, the essence of Bhagavan's Chit and Ladini potencies of its Sarup Shakti in what is known as Prema. The whole thing is simply to get the mind in a state that it's fit to receive this grace. What you do, how does it play out in society, who thinks what, who does what does it look like historically, or this or that, is all superficial, is all secondary. Unless and until the psyche gets attuned in this way, direct perception of Bhagavan, direct divine experience, absorption and the relish of bhakti rasa, all these cherished, objects remain, in waiting. So, however it is that one goes about the process, it will prove successful, regardless of the opinion of people of the world or what have you. It will actually be successful if it produces this psychological transformation. If the vasanas, if the conditioning of the mind for anti-bhakti is purged, and the inclination for bhakti specifically is nourished such that vasana becomes the predominant, dominant inclination in the mind, such that one's disposition or swabhav becomes inclined principally towards bhakti and not towards anything otherwise. So repeated practice of sadhana is for this purpose. So one can also use this as a benchmark of introspection. One is going about these practices continuously. How much has that bhakti vasana been nourished? How much has it become predominant? How much have the vasanas for other things withered away? This one can understand from observing the ongoing flux of one's own thoughts and desires on a day in and day out. So, like this, repeated practice of bhakti sadhana is necessary for those who have a unfavorably conditioned psyche, such that it becomes favorably conditioned. The regulation given in the Shastra, I'm going back now, continuing Jiva Goswami's statement, the regulation given in Shastra of repetition for non-siddhas is applicable up to the attainment of the result. In other words, if you haven't achieved the result, keep doing the practice until you get the result. That is, up to the attainment of siddhi and bhakti. because of conjecture of the existence of aparad when obstruction to it, that is, to the manifestation of the effect of the performance of an act of bhakti, that is, siddhi in bhakti, namely prema, is present. So if you haven't achieved prema, that means there's some aparad remaining within you. Therefore, continue practicing sadhana, which purges you of aparad, until you're purged, until you're free from aparad, such that the result, prem bhakti, of its own accord manifests within you by the grace of Sri Krishna. So this is the line of thought about why repeated practice of these activities is enjoined. So, kīrtanīyaḥ sadā hariḥ, why is kirtan to be done continuously? That's why. Since the verse under discussion is principally an instruction for bhakti sadhakas regarding the means by which prem bhakti can be attained, it is to be understood that the injunction Hari is to be praised continuously, kīrtanīyaḥ sadā hariḥ, is given for the purpose of ensuring that sadhakas become free from offense, aparad, which was the point that Mahaprabhu himself implied when he said, Durdaiva midrishi mihajani nanuragaha. I had no anurag, no prem for this name has come up within me, such is my durdaiva, or such is the effect of aparad, as we discussed in the commentary on the previous verse. The necessity of continuous engagement in kirtan of Hari to purify oneself of offense is also stressed in Padma Purana itself. Immediately after the 10 offenses to Sri Bhagavan's names are explained therein. So it's not that we're just, bringing in here the Vedanta Sutra out of nowhere. Rather, where the 10 offenses to Bhagavan's name are stated in the Padma Puran, right after they're mentioned, then the means of removing them, or the means of saving oneself from them, is also directly explained. And guess what the procedure is? It's exactly the same thing as what the Vedanta said is necessary, and it's exactly the thing that Mahaprabhu is enjoining. So let's look at how the Padma Puran also states this point. After Sri Sanat Kumar lists these offenses, Sri Narada asks him the following question. O dear Sanat Kumar, how can we who are inconsiderate, devoid of discernment and detachment, and self-engrossed in the body, dear ones, and wealth, become free from these offenses? Sri Sanat Kumar begins his answer to this question with the following 2 verses, which are cited by Sri Sanatan Pad and Hari Bhakti Vilas, immediately after his citation of the verses listing the 10 offenses to the name from the Padma Puran in the main text, and right after his citation of the verse under discussion, Tṛṇād sunīcena, in the commentary. So, in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, when Sanatana Gosvami cites the 10 offenses and explains them, then he concludes his commentary with this verse Tṛṇād sunīcena to indicate that this is the solution to these problems, and then he cites the verses of the Padma Puran which state exactly that. So those are as follows. Even when an offense to the name occurs somehow by mistake, one should become one whose sole shelter is that is the name, and constantly chant the name. The names of Hari certainly destroy the sins of those who have committed offense to the name. Uttered incessantly, they are certainly effective. So, what's specifically relevant here is this idea that of constantly and incessantly. So Mahaprabhu is saying, sadā, continuously, Hari Kirtan is to be done. And now the Padma Puran is saying, take shelter in the name and chant it constantly. And when the names are chanted incessantly, then they're effective in purifying you of offense. So what is this continued constancy or this incessantness that is spoken of in the Padma Puran? If we can look at how that point is explained, then we'll also get light about what is the intent of Mahaprabhu's statement that kirtan is to be done continuously. So, Sri Baladev Vidyabhushan Pad also cites these 2 verses in his commentary on Sri Rupa Pad's Namashtakam. and there he gives the following explanation of the intended meaning of the description in the second aforecited verse of the names being uttered incessantly. So the 7th verse of the Namashtakam is Rupa Goswami's poetic rendering of this verse of the Padma Puran about how one is purified of offense. So Baladeva Dibhushan, in his commentary on the Namashtakam, cites the verse from the Padma Puran that inspired that verse of the Namashtakam, and then explains the import of that verse in the Padma Puran. And the essence of his explanation is his gloss of this phrase, uttered incessantly, or avishrani prayuktani, is avishranta prayuktani, is the actual statement in the Sanskrit. So he explains this as follows. Continuously uttered, that is, chanted, with endurance of past offenses and desistance from future ones. So, simple statement, but it carries great significance. So, to chant constantly or to chant incessantly means to chant while enduring the consequences of one's past offenses and desisting from future offenses. So the import of this explanation is that, quote, continuously chanting the name means chanting the name while enduring the consequences of one's past offenses and desisting from committing any further offenses to the name. This is an important matter of reflection. It is not merely a mechanical quantitative process of repetition of the names that leads to purification of one's offenses. So, in other words, no matter what volume of names you chant, as you do so, if you don't succeed in desisting from continuing to commit offense, then you're not purified of offense. So, which aspect should be given more attention? In other words, yes, chant all the time, chant lakhs and lakhs, whatever. But if you're not attentive to, if you don't study carefully how to be free from offense as you do so, then you'll go on chanting quite a while. Bahu janma jadi, there's a statement there in the Charitamrita on this exact same subject where it says, you can chant, the name for many, many lifetimes and never achieve Krishna Prem. So the manner of chanting is more significant than the volume of chanting. And the manner of chanting is to be learned from these points given by the acaryas. And attention is to more the approach than the literal activity. Of course, not to diminish the importance of doing the activity. It's no doubt important. But how it is that one can successfully desist from committing future offenses, and how one can adjust oneself such that one can perseveringly endure the consequences of past offenses, this is all important. So regardless of whether one chants lakhs and lakhs of Sri Bhagavan's names, if one does not do so, while successfully refraining from committing further offenses, then one will not become fully purified and will not achieve the goal of prema bhakti. It is only chanting the name while successfully desisting from committing further offenses that results in purification of one's past and present offenses, and ultimately the attainment of prema bhakti. And that is accomplished only by chanting the name with the 4 qualities explained in the verse under discussion. So how do you chant without committing further offenses? That's exactly what Mahaprabhu is teaching you. That's Tṛṇād sunīcena, taror sahiṣṇunā, amāninā mānadena. That's why these qualities are all important. Because without these qualities, you'll keep on committing aparad, and therefore no matter how much you chant, you'll never achieve prem and you'll never purify yourself. So the manner, the qualities, the spirit of the thing is always more important than the form or the quantity of the thing. This is the gist of what's coming out from this discussion. In this regard, Sri Chakravartipad compares these 4 qualities to a robust stone fortification that protects the creeper of a sadhaka's bhakti from the elephant of offenses that can otherwise trample and destroy that bhakti creeper. So this is an interesting statement of Chakravarti Pad from the opening of his commentary on the 7th canto of the Bhagavatam, which definitely seems to be inspired from the analogy given in the Rupa Shiksha by Mahaprabhu of this bhakti creeper, which is planted in the heart, nourished by Shravan, Kirtan, and to be trimmed of, or, the branches of other pursuits and desires are to be trimmed off, and it is to be protected from this mad elephant of aparad, which can uproot it. So, inspired by that analogy, Chakravarti Pad summarizes its gist in this Sanskrit verse, saying, "Therefore, the creeper of bhakti, born of the grace of the sadhus, and set within the great stone-built enclosure of humility, respectfulness, and so on, is to be protected from the elephant of offenses against sadhus, and to be nurtured with sprinklings of the water of hearing and so forth by human beings." So similarly, if we apply the analogy, you can water your creeper, you can fertilize your creeper, you can do all kinds of things to try to make your creeper grow. But if a big elephant comes and rips it up, then it all goes in vain. So similarly, no matter how much Shravan Kirtan you do, if you don't succeed in avoiding aparad, it'll all ultimately get uprooted. So he here compares the 4 qualities in this verse of humility, respect, non-expectation of respect, or freedom from conceit, and tolerance. He compares this to like a wall that protects your creeper, or protects your kirtan, protects your cultivation of bhakti. So without those qualities, then your practice or your creeper is exposed and likely to fall victim to the effects of your past offenses. In other words, the tendency within you, right? The elephant is not somewhere else. The elephant is also existing in your own mind. The elephant is also there. The animal, what do they call that? I forget, the zoomorphication, or in other words, not anthropomorphization, but the manifestation of your own offenses in the form of an animal, or your own thoughts, or the effects of that vasana for sin that was mentioned in the previous commentary, is compared to this mad elephant that's running around inside your own head. So to protect this other thing that's existing in your heart, this carefully fragile, gentle creeper of this bhakti vasana, to ensure that that remains nourished, and this strong, violent vasana that's there from the effects of your past sins and offenses doesn't just rip it up. In other words, that your mind doesn't just get carried away by it, such that it acts contrary to that bhakti vasana, or fortifies the unfavorable vasana, and diminishes the strength of the bhakti vasana, so that such unfavorable thought and action and speech doesn't occur. Then these qualities of humility, respect, tolerance, and pridelessness are so essential. So this is how one can protect that creeper, or protect that bhakti vasana. So this is the import of the whole verse, that the verse is taught to free a sadhaka from aparad, and these qualities are what succeed in doing that, enable one to succeed in doing that. So although there is no doubt that the 4 qualities of respectfulness, mānadena, non-conceitedness, amāninā, tolerance like a tree, taror sahiṣṇunā, and humility greater than even grass, Tṛṇād sunīcena, are a fail-safe means of avoiding aparad, aptly chanting Sri Bhagavan's name, and thus attaining prem bhakti and experiencing Sri Bhagavan's madhurya. The great struggle for those troubled by past offenses is that the effects of their offenses condition the psyche contrarily to these 4 qualities, such that a sadhaka finds these qualities very difficult to cultivate, even after acquiring knowledge of their essential characteristics and importance. A well-known Bengali saying in this regard conveys the sentiment of dispiritedness that many feel after hearing these 4 qualities needed to succeed in bhakti sadhana, and personally finding them difficult to acquire. quote, "I had a great desire at heart to become a Vaishnava. With the Tṛṇād verse, however, a snag befell me." Vaishnav habamali borochido sad. Tṛṇād shlokete shuni poregilavad. It definitely doesn't ring quite as nicely in English as it does in Bangla, but it's a charming expression. So this sentiment is had by those who find themselves to be afflicted by or troubled by these unfavorable vasanas. So what to do? We have this goal. To get to this goal, we have to uproot these difficult to eradicate obstacles, and the qualities that dispel them are also difficult to imbibe and sustain. So what to do? It's a struggle. It's like a catch-22, as was discussed earlier in reference to those Gita commentaries. So now the thread of approach is explained. So as was discussed earlier, in accord with the principle taught in Srimad Bhagavatam, that bhakti is the cause of bhakti, bhaktya sanjataya bhaktya. It is only by struggling to engage in bhakti sadhana, by fostering these qualities to whatever extent one is able at one's present stage, that a sadhaka can gradually purify the psyche and acquire these qualities to a degree of depth that they can then successfully refrain from committing any further offenses as they engage in bhakti sadhana. So it might be hard, you might have minimal ability, but with whatever ability you've got, try. And by that trial, gradually, then the bhakti vasana will grow. Gradually, those qualities will become more well established within one's character, and little by little, the effect of, or the disturbance caused by the previous conditioning, by the unfavorable conditioning, will wither away. A little bit like, I remember once I was visiting Mauritius, and some of the Vaishnavas there, they took me to a factory and said they wanted me to meet the owner of the factory, who was also a Vaishnava. And I wasn't so inclined, but they obliged me to go. But the gentleman was actually a very, very nice gentleman, Vaishnava gentleman, and he told me his life story and how he was born into a poor family, and as a teenager, his parents asked him to try to earn some money for the family because it was difficult for them to survive. So he would go out every day with some peanuts on his bike. He would, roast up a few peanuts and then go out on his bike on the streets and sell the peanuts. And he spoke a little bit of English, but I don't know if he was aware of the English expression that we have when there's a discussion of money and there's an amount of money that's considered very little or very trivial, then we sometimes say, that's peanuts. Don't give me peanuts or something like that. So I didn't say that, but I found it the metaphorically a little bit ironic or humorous that he literally began his business with peanuts. But as a teenager, he persevered and gradually earned more money, and then gradually got a stand, and then started to sell more, and then started to sell other vegetables and fruits, and then he got a store, and then he started to sell other products and groceries, and then eventually he got a factory, and then he was importing all kinds of things from India, and now he was a big successful businessman with a factory that was producing different types of grains and milling things and selling all types of household products, and he was employing foreign workers from Bangladesh, and he was having me come and talk Bangla to the Bangladeshis in the factory and all of this, and was a donor and a contributor to many of the local Vaishnava temples and so on. And he was a very dignified, nice Vaishnava gentleman who had begun from a humble upbringing and whose humility or whose gentleness he'd retained that in the course of also becoming successful in business. So I just share that example to say that, he started out with very little. He had no capital, so to speak, but he struggled with peanuts, literally, and then little by little, day by day, increased his capital until he became, wealthy and, possessed of a lot of capital. So similarly, for a sadhaka, they may find that they don't have much humility, they don't have much tolerance, they don't have much respect. They're, very plagued by poverty, or they're very plagued by this, unfavorable set of, vasanas in the psyche. So they're, so to speak, spiritually poor, or spiritually in a state of, austerity. But what do you do in that situation, right? You have to struggle through it. You have to, work with whatever little you've got. If you can manage a little bit of humility, a little bit of tolerance, then do that. And if you can just do whatever you're able on a daily basis and sustain that, the capacity, the capital, will slowly increase. So in this way, bhakti is the cause of bhakti. Or in other words, with whatever little opportunity one has to do sadhana bhakti, do that sadhana bhakti, and little by little it will lead to the purification of the psyche and further self-manifestation of higher forms of bhakti. So this is how, the approach can be thought of for a sadhaka as far as how they can practically apply these things. But just as, someone who's in a state of poverty may find it overwhelming to think about how they can succeed at business, so to speak, and as we cited this Bengali saying, when I heard the Tṛṇād of peace and H universe, I thought, oh no, it's too hard. So similarly, although it can be daunting, don't give up. It is possible. There are, success stories. There are people who start and do find it hard, but by their perseverance and determined effort, then they'll eventually succeed. And of course, as it's been mentioned earlier and will be mentioned again, it's not that this process is as, bitter or as dry as business, because in business you're, entirely relying on your own efforts, whereas in the context of bhakti, you also have the grace, the support of Bhagavan himself, of Guru, of Vaishnavas, of sadhus. So there's also, favorable support working in your favor to the extent that you also make your effort. So your effort is necessary, but the grace of Bhagavan will ultimately be even more effective in bringing you forward than your efforts. This is something that we discussed recently in the Bhagavatamrita, and is also mentioned in connection with the Dambandhan Lila, and is something that's well known. Okay, so let's see. There's just a little bit left. Let me go on here. Since bhakti, as a faculty of Sri Bhagavan's Sarup Shakti, is certainly capable of circumventing the conditioning of the psyche affected by the Maya Shakti, as a result of one's past offenses, that obstructs these qualities, maybe that should be singular, obstruct these qualities from becoming integrated into one's disposition, excessive dispiritedness in regards to one's struggles in this regard is unnecessary and unfounded, since it fundamentally originates only in identification with a false sense of self and a lack of shraddha. So in the course of following this process, one will make mistakes, one will find it difficult, one will face setbacks, one will struggle, all of this is there. But one shouldn't give up or become excessively dispirited by that. To feel dismay or discomfort or difficulty from time to time, that's fine, that's normal. But it shouldn't become excessive such that it hampers one's ongoing perseverant efforts, because to do so is to lack sight of the fact that the Shakti that one is drawing down upon oneself, so to speak, the Sarup Shakti, is inherently superior to the Maya Shakti. And all the difficulties that one faces are not actually inherent in the self or the jiva, nor are they, coming from the higher Shakti that's working in your favor. They're only, the effects of, the quote-unquote enemy that you're trying to free yourself from. So by becoming dispirited by your own shortcomings, you're also falling into the clutches of the thing that you're trying to overcome. And you're doing so because you're still thinking that you are those things that are harming you when you're actually not. So that dispiritedness can ultimately be drawn back to a state of avidya, or a lack of understanding of self, and a lack of strength of conviction or shraddha in the process. So no matter how conditioned one can become, the Sarup Shakti can still dispel such conditioning. There's a verse also cited in Hari Bhakti Vilas about Harinam, which says that the name has the power to purify you of more sins than you can ever commit. There's a nice Bengali summary of that verse. No, it doesn't come to mind right now. Anyway, this is a common statement that you cannot be as bad as Bhagavan as grace can be good for you. You're a tiny, minute entity. Bhagavan is an infinite entity. His purification, his grace is always more powerful than your ability to be self-deluded or to even engage in self-harm. So there's no point in to give up on the process by saying it's impossible is either to not understand the elements involved or to remain identified with the false self or lack conviction in the process that's been taught. So reflection on one's shortcomings, attentiveness, and openness to recognizing one's own faults, that's essential. But depression or excessive concern about them such that one doesn't continue to perseveringly try with a hopeful, positive attitude will also be detrimental. So, by instead heartily taking shelter in Bhagavan's name with firm shraddha and prayers for grace, chanting Sri Bhagavan's name and engaging in other forms of bhakti sadhana as far as possible, and endeavoring to refrain from committing any further offenses by cultivating these four qualities as far as one is able, one will receive the grace of the name and bhakti in the form of their purifying influence over the psyche. And to the extent that this occurs, these four qualities will become progressively more deeply established in one's disposition, and one will thus express these qualities all the more naturally in one's thoughts, speech, and action. Fundamental to the entire process, then, is shraddha in Bhagavan, his name, and bhakti to him, and strong desire to attain one's spiritual goal of Krishna Prem. So therefore, shraddha is the eligibility or the adhikar for the path of bhakti. Shraddhavan jan hoy bhakti adhikari shraddhanusari hoy. Uttam madhya. I forget that pyre. Anyway, it's saying the person who's eligible for the path of bhakti is the person with shraddha, and they're eligible to the extent that they have shraddha. So these are these qualities are, fundamental to the entire process is shraddha in Bhagavan and strong desire to attain the goal. These, meaning shraddha and one's desire, which is based on one's shraddha, are acquired principally from association with sadhus, and thus the grace, teaching, and association received from sadhus is the underlying basis of all success in the process. So Krishna Bhakti Janmamul Hoy Sadhu Sangha. Therefore, Sadhu Sangha is the birthplace, if you will, of Bhakti for Krishna. So this is how all this discussion maps onto the broader scope of understanding about how a jiva in samsara comes to the path of bhakti and ultimately succeeds in it. So there's a tiny bit more, but it looks like we're out of time for today. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll just wrap up the final couple of points on the verse, and then move ahead, finally, in the Padyavali to further discussion of Nama-kirtana or Nam-mahatmya in the text. So I'll pause here for today, and I'll just reload this in case anyone has a comment, and that'll be it. So just one sec. Haribol, Haribol, Haribol.
Jairante,
Yes, please.
There's something appears to be some time limit for this session. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I reloaded something in the system of my computer, and since I reloaded it, it applies this timer on the meetings. So
Okay.
I'll see if I can fix that later. Sorry.
Okay, fine. Okay, so I would like to initiate a little discussion in the context of the verse Sadā. I'm sorry, in the context of practicality or possibility of performing all the instructions of Shastra, because as you mentioned, Shastra will never recommend instructions that would not be possible for a reader of that instruction to perform.
Well, for the adhikari.
Okay. Adhikari. Okay, so I understand. So that's why Puranas are divided into 3: Sattva, Rajas, Tamas, and those are for different adhikaris. Is that right?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So some statements of Shastra are not practical for someone who is not eligible to perform them. So it seems like that the statement is quite general, and it's not very specific. To state that all instructions are practicable in Shastra. Shastra will never recommend something that one cannot practice. That it's an incomplete statement because it doesn't include adhikari.
It's implied.
Implied?
Right. No injunction is ever given without a specific adhikar for the injunction. That's another hermeneutic that's mentioned in the 11th canto, various places.
Okay, fine. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so another thing is the sadā. When you mentioned sadā, I was contemplating about this statement that Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur makes is that sadā doesn't mean every moment, but every day, for period of time of the day. He said, I would like to add that if instruction would actually say, do it at every moment, remember Vishnu at every moment, means that you're already perfect. I mean, only perfect siddhas can remember Vishnu every moment. So the instruction obviously doesn't say it at every moment. Sadā doesn't mean every moment because it would be.
Very good point. Exactly.
So this. Maybe I'd like to know this verse from Chaitamrita that you mentioned that that by chanting numbers will not, someone can chant all his life, but not obtain prema because of the attitude of the chanter. I'm not sure which verse you're referring to. Would you be able to quote it? Like, do you have it of?
Yeah, what is it? Bahu janma kori jari shravan kirtan tabu na pai Krishna pade premadon. That you can do kirtan shravan for many births and still not attain the wealth of prem for Krishna's feet.
Yeah, but in a context, what's the context?
The context is in the explanation of aparad. It's in verse Adi 8.16.
I see. And that's the place where Mahaprabhu says, when tears don't fall from our eyes, that means that we commit aparad while chanting the holy name.
Yeah, that verse of the Bhagavatam is cited in that same prakaran.
That's it, prakaran. Okay. So which chapter is this? Which skanda?
Adi Lila, chapter 8.
8. Okay. Oh yeah, right. Okay, fine. Okay. This is good. I had a few questions when you were explaining. But this is very interesting. Deliberation on all this Nam Tattva. It's so important because, as you said, it's just the redundancy doesn't make it. Although repetition is recommended for sadhaka, but he has to mindful repetition, right? Careful repetition, deliberated repetition, not mechanical repetition. You know.
Yeah, maybe we could call it educated repetition.
Okay.
Having learned what the acaryas teach, will that be important? Like, should we do sadhana studying what the acaryas taught, or should we just do sadhana without bothering to study?
Right.
Like, why, I don't know, but this mystery of the world is that somehow the idea of doing sadhana without studying Rupa Sanatana and Jiva Goswami's teachings is more popular than the idea of studying their teachings and doing sadhana on the basis of that. Aho Vishnu Maya!
It seems like very simple, right? I think there's a tendency of extracting some imports or statements, absolute statements from Shastra, and applying them like indiscriminately without the context or understanding of why they say that, and idealizing and simplifying the sadhana based on idealistic conclusions of acaryas. And yeah, this is the thing that
sorry folks, no shortcuts.
Yes.
Have a go, see how far you get. If you're lucky, you'll realize the shortcut's not getting you there.
Right. No shortcut here, exactly. Well, if you look carefully on our history of our whatever you read, right? Chaitanya Charitamrita, Chaitanya Bhagavat, Mahaprabhu was discussing Bhagavatam in depth, discussing Shastra in depth. With who? With his associates, with devotees around, and not only that, they were like experts in Vedic knowledge, either singing or on Sanskrit or whatnot. It's just Mahaprabhu expressed this joy of raga bhakti, raganuga bhakti, but that was just expression of the whole complex and complete understanding of scriptures. That was also this part of the sadhu sangha that he gave and exchange with Vaishnavas. Like for example, he used to go to Tota Gopinath every single day to listen Bhagavatam from Gadadhar Pandit, right? So, and which books did he favorite? Brahma Samhita. Brahma Samhita is not easy bites to read or understand, right? And other books, right? So, but yet, there's a tendency of just skipping all that and just taking the ecstatic position of Mahaprabhu as the practice. Let's do that. This, as you said, chanting a lot, but do we see changes in someone who chants a lot, like actually, like moving forward? Actually, yeah, I would say, like when you were reading and explaining that the amount of the chanting continuous and how is that ardent? No, continuous and deliberated chanting. Which word did you use?
I'm not good at quoting myself.
Go by flow. Yes, the chanting that is basically insistent. That one is to repeatedly chant, yes, and another is that the chanting has to be like with persistence, done with persistence, with deliberation. These two qualities are quite important because, and how to obtain this state of like complete absorption. And I would say, from my experience, is that it's possible by a lot of chanting. You can condition the mind to become attached to the name and turn off samskaras by filling it with constant chanting. I remember, and this is I exchange this also with others, chant periodically a lot. That is that when you chant a lot, like a whole day, like really all day, or most of the day, then when you go to sleep, the mind is just being conditioned to repeat. And you maybe wake up half a night and the mind is rolling the mantra in the head. And yeah, this is conditional, but it doesn't necessarily give. It gives spiritual experience. It gives dissociation of non-bhakti samskaras, but samskaras that are foreign to bhakti, definitely. But it doesn't give like we're talking about bhava, talking about asakti, talking about levels where actually the fruit of bhakti appear. Bhava is the fruit of sadhana, right? So I'm just saying that it's not enough to do that. You have to have this wide understanding. I was encouraged by others, I have to tell you that. Just chant, and understanding of Shastra will come to you. And I find it untrue, actually. Although some revelation and some subjective understanding may intuitionally come, but what if your intuition is wrong? What if you mix all your previous experiences with some kind of internal realization that sounds like semi-shastric conclusions? So that's why, as you said, you have to study to always keep a very strong, clear reference. Even if you have some internal revelation, it has to be in reference to Shastra, not just because you thought it's great, it sounds good, right? So, and that's why we have these different schools. One group teaches this, another group teaches this, and somebody quoting, oh, this guru says this, guru says that, and we have them, or this bhakta says this, and very unique realizations, but are they in reference to Shastra? My question is, right?
The golden principle is that we aspire for the bhav of the Nitya Parikaras, and we study and follow as far as possible the teachings of those very same Nitya Parikaras whose bhav we aspire for. Rup, Sanatan, Raghunath, Jiva. This is the golden principle, that the whole aim of the path of sadhana is to be blessed with the bhav that they have in their hearts and that they expressed and represented in their writings, and therefore their writings have precedence above all others and are the principal subject matter of practice, study, and so on.
That's it.
Bam! Clean, indefeatable, strong, simple.
Yes.
Fits, the most intellectual guy can spend his whole life studying all this, and the simplest guy can understand the principle as to why it would make sense to do so.
Yes, exactly.
So, that's simple. We want that Nitya Parikara's bhav, and we follow them as far as possible. And should anyone historically have written or commented or practiced in such a way that is supportive to understanding that, then we of course we respect that, and we may note that, reflect on that as is applicable. But Rupa and Sanatan, they did not leave their work unfinished. It's not that, Rupa, Sanatan, Jiva, Raghunath, that's just some incomplete idea. They've given copiously and in great detail, a grand theological system and a beautiful, royal road of sadhana into the Dham of Braja. So we feel no dearth, we feel no lack, and we, happily fix our hearts and minds on that and feel great confidence in the purity and the authenticity of such an approach, and that this is the very thing that Mahaprabhu wanted.
Yeah,
and pranams to everybody, jai to everybody.
Yeah, that's the thing. After all, how are we Gaudiya Vaishnavas if we don't study, actually, Gaudiya literature, right?
All right.
Thank you.
So that'll more or less conclude our discussion of the verse Tṛṇād sunīcena, as per discussion of the Gita, the Bhagavad, numerous statements of Jiva Gosvami, Rupa Gosvami, Sanatana Gosvami, some Chakravarti Pad's work, Baladeva Dibhushan's work, etc. So in our next class, we'll just finish the tail end of that and then proceed further into the Padyavali. All right. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Radhe Shyam.